He started as a reformer vowing to defend democracy.
Свобода слова, свобода совести, свобода средств массовой информации, права собственности. Эти основополагающие элементы цивилизованного общества будут надежно защищены государством.
He turned into a dictator threatening humanity.
Если кем-то принято решение уничтожить Россию, тогда у нас возникает законное право ответить. Да, для человечества это будет глобальная катастрофа. Для мира будет глобальная катастрофа. Но я все-таки как гражданин России и глава российского государства тогда хочу задаться вопросом. А зачем нам такой мир, если там не будет России?
How did it come to this, and how much further will Putin go? This is a story 2 decades in the making.
Eric Campbell, ABC News, Moscow.
In 1999, I was living in Russia as the ABC's Moscow correspondent when a man few Russians had even heard of suddenly came to power. The appointment of Vladimir Putin as Prime Minister, and within months his anointment as President, was a shock and a mystery. Was this former KGB spy really a Democrat, as his backers claimed, or a hardliner? Was he a potential friend of the West, as diplomats hoped, or an inevitable enemy? Well, for more than 20 years, I've been following his rule as the world tried to work out who he really was.
Если вы сейчас не сыграете хорошо...
Внимание! Тишина! Мотор!
It's hard to imagine now, but when Putin first emerged, Russians could ridicule their rulers. In early 2000, I visited the set of one of the most popular TV programs, Kukli, meaning puppets. For years, they had made fun of the feeble and apparently alcoholic president, Boris Yeltsin. Now they were wrestling with a new rubbery figure who'd just been named acting president. Their director, Grigory Lubomirov, admitted they were struggling.
С начала этого нового года, нового века, нового тысячелетия у России новый руководитель. И так же, как для западных людей, так же и для России, человек не очень известный, не очень знакомый.
Their first idea was to make him the evil Mr. Hyde to Yeltsin's Dr. Jekyll. Later, they settled on a young but menacing Napoleon.
Вы, кажется, хотели что-то сказать?
Да.
Ну, смелей же, смелей. Со мной вы можете быть совершенно откровенным.
I'd been living in Russia for 4 years, watching a country struggle with its newfound freedom.
Извините, Михаил Сергеевич, а советское телевидение можно сделать небольшое интервью?
The last Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, had overseen the collapse of the Soviet Union into 15 separate countries. Boris Yeltsin was steering Russia from communism to capitalist democracy, and it was a wild ride. The state had nearly fallen apart as Western-backed reformers sold off public assets on the cheap. A few grew astonishingly rich, while most struggled to survive, wondering why their superpower was now a beggar state. Suddenly, a shadowy bureaucrat was promising to make Russia great again. In a report for Foreign Correspondent, I traced Putin's unremarkable origins in post-war Leningrad, now renamed St Petersburg. I visited the shabby communal apartment where he grew up. Then, as now, 3 families shared one toilet and one stove. I went to his old school, where his teacher told me she barely remembered him.
Его все же вспомнила, хотя долгое время не могла вспомнить. Вот меня спрашивают, учила я или не учила Путина. Я говорю, ну не могу вспомнить, 30 лет прошло. Володя Путин не был лидером. Он не был лидером.
Nor did he appear to be a Democrat. After studying law, he joined the ruthless Soviet spy agency, the KGB. His job disappeared with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but his old law lecturer threw him a lifeline. Professor Anatoly Sobchak was now the liberal mayor of St Petersburg and hired young Vladimir as his deputy.
Это человек, который понимает, что такое рыночная экономика, что такое частная собственность.
Но Путин был из КГБ. КГБ был враг демократии.
Вы знаете, и в КГБ работали разные люди, и в КГБ работали люди, которые заботились о государстве, о своей стране. Таким офицерам КГБ, офицерам разведки принадлежит Путин.
Putin's lucky break would change history. The KGB veteran proved adept at capitalism, managing the city's property deals, many of them with a stench of corruption. Putin's loyal discretion gained the attention of Yeltsin, who made him head of the KGB's domestic successor, the FSB. And it was here that he really proved his worth. Yeltsin's family was facing a corruption investigation. In what seemed a classic KGB sting, the chief prosecutor, Yuri Skuratov, was filmed with 2 prostitutes, and the tape was leaked to TV. Putin publicly authenticated the video, ending the corruption investigation.
Мое мнение по этому вопросу известно. Оно соответствует мнению президента и премьер-министра страны. Юрий Ильич должен уйти в отставку.
Weeks later, Yeltsin named Putin prime minister and preferred successor.
The immediate reaction was shock and disbelief. The ruble fell sharply and the stock market plunged 10%. Few analysts give the Yeltsin loyalist much chance of winning the presidential elections. Many suspect a darker agenda.
Putin would soon make himself highly electable.
Police have not yet ruled out foul play in this disaster.
Apartment blocks started toppling across Russia. Prime Minister Putin blamed terrorists from the breakaway Republic of Chechnya and mounted a full-scale invasion. Thousands of civilians were killed in Chechnya.
But this is a popular war in Russia. Most blame Chechens for recent terrorist bombings that killed almost 300 people. And all the while, the military build-up continues. Concerns about the civilian carnage is having no effect whatsoever on the conduct of this war.
The apparent success on the battlefield gave Putin the popularity he needed. In March 2000, he won what would prove to be Russia's last relatively free presidential election. The Putin era had begun. A year into Putin's presidency, the Kukly program was wrestling with a new problem. It had boldly continued to satirize Putin and his unpopular administration.
Еще проблемы тут со светом и теплом.
С чем, с чем?
С теплом и светом.
Какие?
Не тепла, ни света нету.
Putin's office was now demanding they stop using the Putin puppets.
Ведь вы же говорили...
Путина, которого вы видите сегодня, это четвертый вариант Путина. На наш взгляд, он просто душевный, милый, привлекательный человек. И мы удивляемся, почему он не нравится президенту. Это открытый взгляд, голубых глаз. Очень, по-моему, приятное лицо.
The government had begun a crackdown on all independent media, starting with Kukli's station, NTV. Authorities had mounted dozens of raids, interrogating hundreds of staff. I spent a week at the station as the Kremlin tried to install its own management.
Журналистский коллектив не признает законным новое руководство и намерен отстаивать свою позицию, а также свободу слова до конца. Сейчас идет...
The Kremlin insists it's simply an investigation of financial fraud, but it could see the Kremlin take over Russia's last independent television network. Many here fear it marks the beginning of the end of Russian democracy.
NTV's general director, Yevgeny Kiselyov, said Putin was showing his true colours.
Yes, I think that Mr. Putin is not a Democrat and not a liberal. And I'm quite convinced that Mr. Putin is an opportunist. You can have NTV shut down, or at least taken over, so that NTV would not report about corruption, crime, drugs, Chechen war. You will have virtual reality, as if everything is okay, everything's fine.
Putin already had that virtual reality in Parliament. The remnants of the Communist Party, a determined foe of Boris Yeltsin, had sensed the change of wind and fallen into line behind Putin. The only real opposition left was a small liberal party, Yabloko, led by Grigory Yavlinsky. He told me Putin was sending a message to all media.
It's enough to make a demonstration. It's enough to give the example. It's enough to make a strong and well-known precedent. And then everything is made in the same way. Easily.
Yavlinsky made a stand for NTV and failed.
В истории останется уничтожение свободы слова.
NTV was swallowed up by the Kremlin. Kiselyov and the rebel journalists were sacked. With television now under Putin's control, he was able to shape the message. Russia was growing stronger. The humiliation of the 1990s was over. In the 2003 parliamentary elections, Yabloko failed to win a single seat. Grigory Yavlinsky told me he wouldn't even bother voting in the next presidential election.
We failed to explain to the voters that the democracy can be real. They don't believe anymore.
Putin was becoming more a Tsar than a president. The Russian Orthodox Church had thrown its full support behind the Kremlin. Father Vsevolod, the spokesman for the Moscow Patriarch, welcomed the opposition's demise.
The liberal opposition only exists in the Western media. I am very much surprised that even 1% of the population has supported certain of the extreme liberal protests. In fact, they totally failed.
What's more, he told me their failure was a blessing, Western democracy being alien to Russian tradition.
If a society is divided along the commercial interests or political convictions, it's illness. It's not a creative conflict. And we always opt for unity of the society.
Putin wasn't taking any chances. He'd formed a Putin youth group to target opposition rallies. It was a response to youth-led colour revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine that had brought pro-Western leaders to power. At a summer camp, these young counter-revolutionaries were even given military training. Putin held forth to them on a growing obsession: Western attempts to weaken Russia.
Мозги им надо поменять, а не конституцию нашу. Мозги. И я скажу почему. Потому что то, что они предлагают, это очевидный рудимент колониального мышления.
With democracy out of the way, Putin was starting to move on his real agenda, restoring Russian might. In 2005, he'd made a stunning speech revealing his nostalgia for the Soviet Union.
Прежде всего следует признать, и об этом я уже говорил, что крушение Советского Союза было крупнейшей геополитической катастрофой века. Для российского же народа оно стало настоящей драмой. Десятки миллионов наших сограждан и соотечественников оказались за пределами российской территории.
It wasn't Soviet communism he missed. Like the Russian Orthodox Church, he was pining for the Russian Empire.
Not the Soviet Union, but the historical Russia, with dozens of millions of people who are speaking Russian, who are Russians, remaining nowadays in other states. This is a national catastrophe.
Russia still had a democratic constitution with a two-term limit for the presidency. But that was a technicality Putin easily overcame, putting forward his protege and gym buddy, Dmitry Medvedev, to take over for a term while Putin ruled as prime minister.
Главное для развития нашей страны – это продолжение спокойного и стабильного развития.
As expected, Medvedev would be Putin's puppet until he could formally resume the presidency 4 years later. Putin would continue to have vocal critics, but one by one they would meet untimely ends. By 2011, Russia's last independent newspaper, Novaya Gazeta, had a sickening tally of murdered reporters. 6 had been poisoned, beaten to death or shot, including chief investigative reporter Anna Politkovskaya, gunned down outside her Moscow apartment.
Here she was sitting when she was alive and working in Novaya Gazeta. It wasn't really...
Yelena Milashna took over her role and the target on her back that came with it, and would later have to flee the country.
I feel angry. I'm not feeling any fear anymore. I have to do what I have to and let it be what it be. So that's the country. It's not the paper. It's not that I will be safe if I quit with journalism. Nobody is safe in this country. The difference between people and me is that I understand that.
I found my thrill on Blueberry Hill.
The growing number of dead critics hadn't stopped Putin being feted as an intriguing, even sexy world leader. At this 2010 charity event in St Petersburg, he was joined by Hollywood celebrities like Goldie Hawn, Sharon Stone and Monica Bellucci. state TV, he was regularly taking his shirt off, posing as an alpha male he-man in a world of insipid liberals. But against the odds, some liberals were still risking all to oppose him. Among them, the man once tipped to be Yeltsin's successor.
Я считаю, что мы точно добьемся справедливости. Я считаю, что Путина надо отправить в отставку. Россия должна быть без Путина. Россия без Путина. Россия без Путина. Долой власть воров! Долой власть воров!
Boris Nemtsov was Yeltsin's deputy prime minister, but he'd just done jail time for unauthorised protests.
Mr. Nemtsov, 12 years ago, many people said you would be president. Instead, Mr. Putin got the job and he's just put you in jail. Do you regret the way things have turned out?
Ельцин ошибся. Он перепутал преемника.
4 years later, Nemtsov was shot dead while strolling past the Kremlin. There was still one opposition politician who Putin feared, so much so that state TV was ordered to never even mention his name.
Я отказываюсь слушать эти рассказы о том, что мы должны еще здесь, знаете, затянуть свои пояса. Вы хотите затягивать пояс? И я не хочу. Я иду на выборы, объединяя этих людей. Я вот езжу из города в город и говорю: ребят, хватит терпеть. Сколько мы будем ждать?
Alexei Navalny was no Western-style liberal. He had been expelled from the Yabloko party for his hardline nationalist views and even supported Putin's annexation of Crimea. The government had banned him from running for president through a bogus fraud conviction. He told me it didn't matter.
Правительство говорит, что вы не можете стать кандидатом до 2022 году. Что делать?
Ну, правительство предпочло бы, чтобы я вообще никогда не был кандидатом, вообще не участвовал ни в какой избирательной кампании, вообще не занимался никакими антикоррупционными расследованиями. Мне не интересует, что думает правительство, потому что я иду на эти выборы для того, чтобы сменить правительство, для того, чтобы отстранить этих людей от власти.
What drove Navalny and his popularity was outrage at Kremlin corruption. Navalny's team flew drones over the walled estates of Putin's inner circle, exposing the world-class theft of Putinists like the stunt president Dmitry Medvedev.
О, эти дьявольские хитрецы из Кремля! Летим назад. Общая площадь резиденции более 80 гектаров. Это почти как 3 Кремля, ну или 30 красных площадей. Ее рыночную стоимость мы даже и оценить не можем. Реконструкция старинной усадьбы, несколько домов, бассейны, гостиница, лыжный склон, подземные объекты. Мы предполагаем, что возвести такой комплекс стоит не меньше 25-30 миллиардов рублей. Вот, кстати, доска для гигантских шахмат. На ней и сам Дмитрий Медведев может быть королем и крушить непокорные фигуры.
Tens of millions watched Navalny's weekly YouTube programs. Until suddenly, like many Putin critics, death came knocking.
We're getting reports that opposition politician Alexei Navalny is in a coma in a Siberian hospital.
Amazingly, he survived what turned out to be poisoning by Novichok, a Russian military nerve agent.
Здрасте, меня зовут Устинов Максим Сергеевич. Я помощник Николая Платоновича Патрушева.
Recuperating in Germany, he pulled off one of the most astonishing stings in spy history, cold calling the FSB hit team assigned to poison him. He tricked one of them into confessing how they tried to remove the evidence.
Обрабатывали. От меня это не было следов, там ничего такого.
Хорошо, скажите мне, пожалуйста, какой предмет одежды, на какой предмет одежды главный был акцент? У нас самый рискованный в теории предмет одежды какой?
Трусы.
Трусы.
внутренним работали. Ну, по крайней мере, там это обработка делали.
Maria Pevchik is the head of his investigations team.
To be honest, that was the most unbelievable day in my career.
Their next coup was releasing an investigation into a Black Sea palace they alleged belonged to Putin.
Шато, винные заводы, устричные фермы и бесконечная роскошь.
He had apparently come a long way from a crowded communal apartment in Leningrad.
We have investigated his history and how ownership changed to prove that this palace has been built for Vladimir Putin by his friends, by the oligarchs. And the place is so expensive that it is probably the biggest bribe ever given in the history of bribing.
Navalny bravely returned to Russia and was thrown in jail. Foreign correspondent filmed the massive protests that erupted across Russia. At his trial, off-camera but recorded on a mobile phone, Navalny delivered what may be the greatest put-down of the Russian century.
Вы знаете, был Александр освободитель, и Ярослав Путин, и будет у нас Владимир Находитель трусов.
Navalny was now silenced, but he had shown what Putin perhaps fears most: people who fight to the bitter end, who don't fear Putin. Putin's obsession with obedience was on stark display in February, when he forced his Security Council to publicly back his plans for Ukraine. His spy chief could barely speak without stammering.
Говорите прямо.
Я поддержу предложение о признании.
Поддержу или поддерживаю? Говорите прямо, Сергей.
Поддерживаю предложение.
Так и скажите, да или нет.
Да. Поддерживаю предложение.
I couldn't help but think back to the Kukli program in 2000, when they portrayed him as Napoleon.
Вы, кажется, хотели что-то сказать?
Да.
Like Napoleon, Putin has embarked on a war of conquest to redraw the map of Europe. And like the French emperor, he's made himself ruler for life.
Кто бы ни пытался помешать нам, а тем более создать угрозы для нашей страны, для нашего народа, должны знать, что ответ России будет незамедлительным и приведет вас к таким последствиям, с которыми вы в своей истории еще никогда не сталкивались.
Putin's invasion of Ukraine is the culmination of his dream to rebuild a Russian empire that once stretched across Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, and the Baltics.
No charisma, no nothing.
Yekaterina Kodrakatsa is one of Russia's leading journalists and, like many, has chosen exile to have the freedom to keep reporting.
He doesn't care about anyone. Civilians in Georgia, members of Russian army, Russian soldiers, has never been a problem for this person. So any amount of victims is all right for him, as we can see right now in Ukraine.
But like Napoleon invading Russia, he has found in Ukraine an enemy who doesn't fear him and won't surrender. The Putin we see today is a different man to the opaque bureaucrat I saw emerge in 1999, claiming to support free speech and democracy. And he's not the same figure who once paraded shirtless to prove his masculine strength against weak Western rivals. Nearing 70, he is suddenly looking old, his face mysteriously bloated, his health a matter of open speculation. Many hope this accidental president will soon pass into history after an improbably long rule. We can only hope his nuclear weapons don't turn Russia's tragedy into a nightmare for us all.